Chapter 28, Progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt, 1901 to 1912. In the beginning of the 20th century, the mixing of the American people had been forced into a reform movement, while the new crusaders who had decided to refer to themselves as progressives and waged the war on multiple levels of corruption, social injustices, disorganization, and monopolies. Much of the popular magazines had begun to appear in the American newsstands during 1902, exposing anything and everything about the supposed corruption and scandal that society loves to drink up. The reform-minded journalists wrote many articles in these magazines which were referred to as muckrakers by President Roosevelt. Also, progressivism reforms were primarily middle-class men and women, while the progressives sought out two different goals: to either use state powers to control the trusts and also to stem the socialist hazard by overall improvising the common person's conditions of life and labor. They supported referendum and recall. As a result of pressure from the public's progressive reformers, the 17th Amendment was passed to the Constitution in 1913 and established the direct election of U.S. senators. Eventually, the states began the march toward progressivism when they undertook the regulation of both railroads and trusts. In 1901, the governor of Wisconsin was a significant figure of the progressive era, seeing as Robert M. La Follette took considerable control of the involved corporations, returning it to the people. The financial panic of 1907 led the way for fiscal reform and ultimately cleared the path for the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The governor of California, known as Hiram W. Johnson, helped to break the dominant grip of the Southern Pacific Railroad politics in 1910. Finally, in 1911, the National Progressive Republican League had been formed with La Follette as the leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. The Taft-Roosevelt explosion occurred in June of 1912 once the Republican convention met in Chicago, so when it came time to vote, supporters of Roosevelt claimed fraud and eventually refused to vote. This gave Taft the upper hand he needed to win the election. Chapter 29, Wilsonian Progressivism at Home and Abroad, 1912 to 1916. Woodrow Wilson had won the governorship of New Jersey while waging a reform campaign in which he confronted the destructive trusts and promised to return the state government directly back to the people for the election of 1912. The Bull Moose campaign consisted of Roosevelt's new nationalism in addition to Wilson's new freedom, and because they both favored a more active government role in economic and social affairs, it was hard to discern who was more suited for the position. Everything heated up when Roosevelt was shot by a fanatic and eventually recovered with the cost of a short campaign suspension. After Taft and Roosevelt split their Republican votes, it gave Woodrow Wilson the presidency, resulting in his Progressive Party dying out due to lack of officials elected. Later, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 lengthened the Sherman Act's list of business that were seen as objectionable, exempting labor and agricultural organizations from such prosecution. The most serious problem of the National Banking Act that was passed during the Civil War in 1863 was the immobilization of currency. For instance, the new Federal Reserve Board, which had been appointed by the President, oversaw the nationwide system of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. This meant that each reserve bank was the central bank of its own region. At the time, Federal Reserve notes were currently in circulation. Lastly, the Progressive and Republican parties met in 1916 to choose their presidential candidates for the next election. And despite being elected, Theodore Roosevelt declined to run, giving up the election to Wilson, as the Democratic tariff was condemned. Chapter 30, The War to End War, 1917 to 1918. On January 31, 1917, Germany had announced its decision to wage unrestricted submarine warfare on all ships, including Americans, within the war zone. America declared war on April 6, 1917. One of the major war acts was the German Foreign Secretary's Arthur Zimmermann, who secretly proposed a German-Mexican alliance with the Zimmermann Note. The news of the Zimmermann Note was leaked out into the public, which completely infuriated Americans. Eventually, Wilson's 14 points was brought into play when he delivered his 14 points address in 1918. This primarily promoted an overall peace program and also had fairly practical uses as a propaganda instrument. Herbert C. Hoover then took control by leading the Food Administration. He rejected the use of rationing cards, and Congress limited the use of foodstuffs for manufacturing alcoholic beverages which aided the coming prohibition wave. Once the Treaty of Versailles was forced upon the Germans during 1919, it made the Germans completely outraged with the treaty, noticing that a majority of the established 14 points had been left out. And many critics of the League of Nations came from all sides, inclusive of Irish Americans, isolationists, and principal liberals were all denounced the entire League. The Lodge-Wilson personal feud was made to be traditional in terms of isolationism, disenchantment, and prejudices that all contributed to the eventual defeat of the treaty. After that, Wilson decided to settle the treaty issue, the upcoming presidential campaign of 1920, and appealed to the people for a solemn referendum, and the Republican platform appealed to both the pro-League as well as the anti-League sentiment in the party. Warren Harding won the election of 1920, soon leading to the demise of the League of Nations. Chapter 31, American Life in the Roaring Twenties, 1919 to 1929. The increasing fear had begun to run high even after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 that eventually spawned a communist party in America. The Red Scare occurred and ended in the general suspicion of those whose Americanism was suspect. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer rounded up many of those supposedly questionable immigrants. The later Ku Klux Klan, Knights of the Invisible Empire, had arisen in the early 1920s. The KKK was a disquieting manifestation of intolerance and predisposition. Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which restricted many of the newcomers from Europe in any given year in order to create a definite quota, which was at approximately 3% of the nationality who had been living in the United States during 1910. Soon enough, the Immigration Act of 1924 replaced the Quota Act and cut the quotas from 3% to 2%. The result of the quota system was a dwindling down of immigration. The act also marked the end of an era of completely unrestricted immigration to the United States. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was passed, and so the prohibition became official. The radio revolution began back in the 1890s and eventually in the 1920s, seeing as the first voice-carrying radio broadcasts were able to reach audiences, and automobiles had begun luring Americans into farther away from home as well, farther than ever before with the later invention of the national highways. Some of the cultural literature of the time period included the creation of The Great Gatsby in 1925. Finally, in the 1920s, the stock market became progressively popular. Chapter 32, The Politics of Boom and Bust, 1920 to 1932. Warren G. Harding was inaugurated in 1921, and much like Grant, was unable to detect the immoral people that were working for him. Harding's greatest and some of his most capable officials were counterbalanced by some of the worst, such as Senator Albert B. Fall, who was an anti-conservationist, in addition to Harry M. Daugherty, who was a large crook chosen to the Attorney General. Soon after, wartime government started to gain control, the economy was finished. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920 was passed, and the Shipping Board decided to dispose of the wartime fleet of approximately 1,500 vessels at low prices. The labor was quickly deprived of its wealth, so Congress created the Veterans Bureau in 1921 in order to help in at least the rehabilitation sense. Public pressure brought into play the Washington Disarmament Conference from 1921 to 1922, which was a proposal of scaling down navies in terms of battleships and aircraft carriers. The Five-Power Naval Treaty of 1922 stated that the British and Americans would refrain from the fortifying of their far-reaching eastern possessions. This led to the Four-Power Treaty between Britain, Japan, France, and the United States, replacing the 21-year-old Anglo-Japanese Treaty, and managed to maintain the status quo in the Pacific. One of the most shocking occurrences was that of the Teapot Dome scandal, which involved the priceless naval oil reserves at the Teapot Dome and Elk Hills. In 1921, Albert B. Fall convinced the Secretary of the Navy that valuable properties of the Interior Department were to be transferred, and received a bribe from the secret order. This was eventually leaked to the public and polluted the Washington government. Calvin Coolidge took over after Harding's death, bringing into effect the McNary-Haugen Bill, which was an attempt to keep prices high by authorizing the government to buy up surpluses and sell them abroad. Later, Herbert Hoover came into power and battled the Great Depression by securing public works and establishing the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, made for indirect economic relief, while also founding the Good Neighbor policy, which resulted in better relations with America's Latin American neighbors. Chapter 33, The Great Depression and the New Deal, 1933 to 1939. As the election of 1932 came into being, more unemployment and poverty brought about the dissent of President Hoover and also a demand for a greater change in policy. The Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover to run for the president in the election of 1932, while the Democrats chose Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt came out on top. He was known as a politician in a wheelchair. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was the most active First Lady in history. She considered herself his legs. She lobbied on his behalf, gave speeches, and was considered a powerful influence on the policies of the government. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the one who constituted the 3 R's, relief, recovery, and reform, and eventually declared a national banking holiday that was set as a prelude to the opening of the banks on a founder basis. The 100 Days Congress/Emergency Congress also passed a series of laws in order to cope with national emergency. The banking crisis brought about the passing of the Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933, giving the President the power to regulate banking transactions as well as foreign exchange to reopen solvent banks. Congress also created the Civilian Conservation Corps, which provided greater employment. The Civil Works Administration was designed to provide temporary jobs for wages on works projects. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, making available millions upon millions of dollars to help farmers meet all of their mortgages. The Works Progress Administration in 1935, which focused on employment of mainly construction workers, and both the Public Works Administration and the National Recovery Administration, designed generally to assist industrial recovery as a whole. Later, to speed up recovery and improve homes, Roosevelt set up the Federal Housing Administration in 1934 and the United States Housing Authority to strengthen it in 1937. The Social Security Act of 1935 provided for much federal state employment insurance as well. Lastly, this brought about the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 after many other labor relations acts, and labor by children under the age of 16 was forbidden. Chapter 34, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Shadow of War, 1933 to 1941. In 1933, 66 nations sent delegates to the London Economic Conference. These delegates had hoped to organize a coordinated international attack on global depression. President Roosevelt at first had agreed to send delegates, but later had second thoughts on the matter after realizing that the agreement to maintain the value of the dollar in terms of other currencies would not allow for inflation. Without the support it needed, the conference fell apart. President Roosevelt withdrew from Asia and eventually formally recognized the Soviet Union by opening up trade, trying to prevent the potential threat of German power in Europe. Congress passed the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937, and the act stated that when the President proclaimed the existence of a foreign war, there were specific restrictions that would quickly become a reality. Then in 1935, Hitler violated the Treaty of Versailles when he introduced mandatory military service in Germany and continued his insatiable desire to accomplish his goals. The Neutrality Act of 1937 also placed an arms trade embargo on Spain while extending the current embargo on Britain and France. This repeated and continued on into 1939. Franklin D. Roosevelt also shattered the two-term tradition, and some feared that a dictatorship was in order. He won the election because America trusted Roosevelt's experience in the War Department more than anyone else at the time. Finally, one of the largest impacts of the era was the surprise assault of Pearl Harbor, and due to the Japanese having to choose between succumbing to America's plans for trade after clearing out of China, the Japanese fought and planned their attack on Black Sunday, 1941, killing thousands. Chapter 35, America and World War II, 1941 to 1945. After the Pearl Harbor bombing, the politicians in Washington, D.C. had adopted the strategy of getting Germany first, so America did not want to divert its attention away from the Pacific in case of Hitler. The idea of politicians was that if Germany was knocked out first, then the Allied forces would be able to be concentrated in Japan. The lingering Great Depression had been brought to an end with the massive military orders, as displayed by the War Production Board. The War Production Board was able to halt the manufacture of the non-essential items, like passenger cars in particular. Later in 1944, the creation of the mechanical cotton picker made the cotton of the South much cheaper when it came to labor. About 25,000 Native Americans began to serve in the armed forces as well. And following the war, there was a national debt that rose from $49 billion all the way to $259 billion in 1945. D-Day in 1944 consisted of President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Stalin meeting in Tehran, Iran, to coordinate a second front. Because the United States was to provide the most Allied troops for the invasion of Europe, American General Eisenhower was granted command. And finally, the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs were what resulted in the surrender of Tokyo and ended this violent war handled primarily through nuclear explosives.